Welcome back to Lecture Highlights, where we try to explain the most important key concepts in economics as quickly, simply, and intuitively as we possibly can. In this lecture highlight video, we'll be completing the first block of lecture highlights on cost-benefit analysis by explaining what economists mean by the idea of sunk costs. And also we'll be looking at the implications of sunk costs for both your decision-making and formal economic analysis. So, sunk costs are just defined as costs that have already been incurred and are completely unrecoverable regardless of your future decision making. So when it comes to cost benefit analysis, we know that we should only do something or buy something if the benefit is greater than the cost. But we have to exclude these sunk costs that have already been incurred because regardless of our future decision making, we can't get these costs back. The challenge, though, is that we don't often behave 100% rationally, and sometimes we take these sunk costs into account when we're performing cost-benefit analysis, even though we shouldn't. So what are the implications for your decision-making, and how does this affect formal economic analysis? These are the key issues that we're going to look at using some really simple examples in this lecture highlight. To understand why sunk costs should be excluded, let's think of a really simple example. So imagine you're at home and you've decided to download a film from Amazon which has cost you £10. And it's a 90-minute film and you decided this is how you want to spend your afternoon. Now 30 minutes into the film, you realise that actually the film isn't very good. Instead, you're getting practically no benefit from continuing to watch. And you're thinking, should I instead decide to do an alternative activity? Well, the question then is, should you continue to watch? Well, if you're not enjoying the film and it's really quite terrible, maybe your benefit from continuing to watch the film is 0 or 5 pence or 10 pence, a really, really small amount. And that just represents your maximum willingness to pay to continue watching the film for the next hour to complete it. But what about the cost of spending that next hour completing the film? Well, even if you don't have any explicit costs, because you've already paid for the film, so you don't have to pay for it again to continue to watch, you also have opportunity costs, because you could instead spend your time doing any other activity. So imagine that that other activity has an opportunity cost of £5. That's really the value that you're foregoing because you could have been spending your time doing that alternative activity, but instead you're watching the film. But now what we can see is that the benefit from continuing to watch the film is only 10 or 15 pence, but the total cost of continuing to watch the film is now £5. That's our opportunity cost. So the cost is higher than the benefit, so we should turn the film off and instead do our alternative activity. The problem, though, is that we don't always behave fully rationally. Instead, sometimes we decide that we've already spent 30 minutes watching the first part of the film, and we've already spent £10 to download the film, so we should definitely see the film through to the end. But this really isn't rational, because that 30 minutes that you've already spent watching the film and the £10 that you paid to download the film cannot be recovered and should not be taken into account for your future decision making, because these are sunk costs. So just because you've spent some cost already, you should continue to make your decisions about the future based on the future benefits and future costs, and only continue to watch if the future benefit is higher than the future cost, regardless of any sunk costs that have been incurred. It's really important then that when we're trying to identify sunk costs, we think about the timing of our decision making. So in that previous example, we said that we've already bought the film and we're 30 minutes into it and we're deciding should we continue to watch the film or alternatively swap to an alternative activity. So we said that the 30 minutes we've already spent watching the film is a sunk cost and it's excluded, and the £10 download price is also excluded as a sunk cost. But if we take a step back to the point where we haven't yet bought the film, that cost of buying the film is no longer a sunk cost. So if I haven't already bought the film and I don't know whether it's going to be a great film or not, I only download the film if I expect the benefit of watching the film is higher than the cost. But the key idea here is that the benefit of watching the film was uncertain, I didn't quite know what the quality of the film is going to be. So we need to make sure that we're identifying when a cost becomes a sunk cost, so after it's been paid, and we exclude these costs from our decision making, and we don't just continue to watch a film because we don't want to go back on our earlier decision. Sunk costs also imply more generally that the idea of doing something to get your money's worth then really often is not rational. So think about the idea of going to a theme park. So the theme park that you've chosen to visit opens at 9 o'clock in the morning and it closes at 6 p.m. And you made your decision to visit the theme park on the basis that the benefit to you of going for the day was higher than the cost. But then by about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, after you're already in the theme park, you find that you've already gone on all of the rides that you wanted to. And you've already done all of the extra activities within the theme park, and there's not much left to do. So you're deciding, should I instead go home or do an alternative activity? Or should I continue to ride the same rides over and over again? Well, imagine if I said to you, what is your willingness to pay then? It's 3 p.m. at the theme park. What's your willingness to pay to spend the next 3 hours continuing to ride the same rides over and over again? And you think to yourself, well, I've already done the rides a couple of times. Maybe I'd get some benefit. So let's say the maximum I'd be willing to pay for those 3 hours is equal to £10. So that represents your benefit then of £10 of spending the next 3 hours continuing to ride the same rides at the theme park. Alternatively though, we need to compare this to the cost, not just in terms of the cost of any explicit costs, but also in terms of opportunity costs. So imagine that there's some alternative activities that you could be doing at home, like going home early and watching TV or doing any other activity, and that has a value to you of £20. So that £20 then in an opportunity cost. So the benefit of continuing to ride the rides is only £10. The cost though is £20, so we should leave the theme park early rather than staying at the theme park. The problem though is sometimes we say to ourselves, but we've already paid the price to get into the theme park. We've already paid the price of the transport to the theme park, so we may as well stay until 6 p.m. and have as many rides as we possibly can. But this idea of doing something just to get our money's worth really isn't rational, because all of those costs relating to transport to the theme park and also the entry cost are completely sunk. And you should only take into account future benefits and future costs when you're performing cost-benefit analysis. So in any situation where you're doing something just to get your money's worth, you might generally be falling into this trap of basing your decisions on sunk costs, when really you could make yourself happier and better off by instead excluding these and only doing something if the benefit is higher than the cost. Sunk costs can also play a really significant role in the optimality of our decision making, especially when we're making big purchases. So think about the decision to buy a house, which is generally the biggest purchasing decision that most people will be making. So imagine that you've been searching around the housing market for a long time and you've finally found your dream house. And your valuation, what that house is worth to you in terms of your benefit, is equal to say £250,000. And the total cost that you have to pay for the house is £230,000. So you decide this is a great buy because there's a net benefit to you of buying this house of the difference, which in this example is £20,000. Now, incorporated in that £230,000 total cost is a £1,000 survey fee, which essentially involves someone who has expertise in building construction going to the house and making sure that the building and the property is structurally safe and has no hidden issues that you need to be aware of. But the key part is that you find out the results of the survey before committing to buy the house completely. So imagine that survey comes back and identifies some hidden issues. Maybe it's got damp or structural problems or some other issues that you weren't aware of before. And this causes you to revise your valuation of the house. So now instead of it being worth £250,000 of benefit to you, it's only worth £220,000. So the question is, should you continue to buy the house anyway, even if the seller refuses to negotiate further on the price and won't come down? Well, now ask yourself, is the benefit higher than the cost? So the benefit is £220,000 and the total cost at this point is £229,000. So the £1,000 that we incurred for the survey is a sunk cost. And regardless of whether or not we buy the house, we can't get that cost back. So clearly we can see that the cost of £229,000 is higher than the benefit of £220,000. So we'd be making ourselves worse off to a value of £9,000 if we go ahead with that purchase. So we shouldn't buy it. The problem though in practice is we don't always behave fully rationally. Instead, because we've already invested £1,000 in the house, we feel like we should definitely go ahead and buy the house anyway because we don't want to accept that we've wasted that £1,000. But this really isn't rational because cost-benefit analysis tells us we should only buy something if the future benefit is greater than the future cost, excluding any sunk costs, and don't take these costs into account. So here in this example, if we don't exclude the cost and we take them into account in our decision-making process, we buy a product that actually leaves us with £9,000 worth of loss in the value to us of what we own. And this concept really applies then to any investment decision that we might be making. So just because you've already invested in the past in a particular product or a particular service does not mean that you should continue to invest in that product or service in the future. Instead, this decision should only be informed by the future benefit being higher than the future cost. The examples then of sunk costs are really endless in practice. In fact, any time you've already incurred a cost, and regardless of what you do in the future, you can't get that cost back, you should exclude that cost from your future decision making. So if you've got a monthly subscription to the gym, don't just go to the gym on one particular day to get your money's worth out of that monthly subscription. Instead, decide whether or not you want to go to the gym on the basis of whether the benefit of going today is higher than the cost. And the same for any other activity more broadly. Only do something if the benefit is higher than the cost. Otherwise, it can lead to suboptimal decision making, and we can be making decisions that actually make ourselves worse off.